because this is a topic that I think is worth talking about from time to time. And I want to begin by sharing the story of a woman called Karen Lineman. And Karen begins her story in this way. My husband came home from work and found me huddled in one corner of the sofa listening to the clock tick. Our 5-year-old daughter Caitlin was playing Barbies by herself in the cold kitchen. No smells of dinner beckoned from the oven. In fact, crusty dishes from yesterday and the day before filled the counter and the sink. Larry spent several minutes picking up the worst of the clutter and then prepared a quick supper. Over dinner, he tried to engage me in conversation, asking about a book deadline I was facing. I told him I was still lagging behind. After dinner, I felt too exhausted to help clean up. I was relieved when it was finally time to put Caitlin to bed. I lay down next to her under the guise of keeping her company until she fell asleep. But in reality, I couldn't wait to close my eyes and give in to sleep myself. I've been exhausted for months. I slept long hours every night and during the day as well. In fact, at any given time of day or night, I found myself able to sit on the couch, close my eyes, and drop immediately into the deepest of sleeps. I wasn't completely sure what was happening to me. All I knew that there was something wrong, terribly wrong. But perhaps the most frightening development of all was that I didn't hear. In Texas, I'd always been an optimistic person with lots of friends. I'd been married for 10 years, I had a successful husband, a beautiful daughter, and the writing career that I'd always dreamed of. I should have been on top of the world, but instead, for nearly a year, I'd been unable to cope with even the simplest of tasks. I seemed to have virtually stopped functioning. I never cooked or cleaned the house. I went for days without changing my clothes, combing my hair, or even brushing my teeth. I was unable to concentrate or think clearly, and even the smallest decision left me feeling overwhelmed. And when I wasn't feeling overwhelmed, I wasn't feeling anything. Not angry, or sad, or happy, or hopeful, just plain nothing. It was as though all of my emotions had simply clicked into the off position. I suddenly couldn't think of a single thing in my life to look forward to. Larry later told me that he just figured I was under pressure from the book deadline. He didn't know how to respond. He tried different tactics. He dangled all the dreams that had driven me in the past before me like a carrot, but nothing caught my eye. He even volunteered to quit the job that he had loved and moved our little family back to California, where I could be near friends and family. He said, "I'll do anything, Karen," he pleaded. "Just tell me what to do. Tell me what I can do to help." And I began to cry. "I think we need to go to counselling. Can you go with me to counselling?" He winced, shook his head. "I'll do anything," he said, "anything but that." Somehow he'd gotten the idea that counselling was for folk who were weak, who were socially unbalanced, who didn't have their act together, and he shied away from it. Around that time, I finally gathered the courage to make an appointment to see the family doctor, hoping he might recommend some vitamins to help me feel better. Instead, he gave me a checklist to work through. And he evaluated my answers. And then he said the 3 magic words that brought both terror and hope into my life. He said, "You're clinically depressed." And depression's a scary word, isn't it? And yet a wave of relief surged over my numb and exhausted spirit. My enemy had a name, and if it had a name, maybe it had a cure. I felt the first stirrings of a fragile hope. Maybe I could lick this thing. The doctor gave me a prescription. He also gave me some advice. Exercise for half an hour, 3 to 5 times a week. I thought Prozac and sweat made an odd combination, but I know now that it's not so strange after all. Both medication and exercise impact our brain chemistry in a positive way. Medication replenishes the serotonin levels, while exercise releases those feel-good endorphins. I wish I'd listened to my doctor. Instead, I only followed his advice for about a week. As a result, my downhill slide continued. That June, my daughter and I travelled to California to spend a month with my parents. Perhaps it was the change of scenery. Perhaps it was seeing my parents' shock over my numb and lifeless state. But I knew that I had to do something to reclaim my life, and a little bit of my stupor began to lift. Larry remembers just getting home from work back in Texas when he got my phone call. I told him I was at the end of my rope and I wasn't coming back. Larry says it took him 20 minutes to throw a few things in a pack and hit the road. He drove through the night and the next day as well. By the next afternoon, he was on the doorstep of my parents' home. He didn't know what was happening to me. All he knew was that he loved me and he was willing to do anything to save me and his marriage. This time, when the topic of counselling came up, we were both in agreement. We returned to Texas and we sought help. We went to counselling for 2 years. Sometimes we went together and worked on issues in our marriage that had led to my depression. Other times I went by myself and sorted through layers of anger and hurt that, compressed and unresolved, had robbed me of my zest for life. I went back on the Prozac. There were days when I thought we were getting nowhere. I alternated between depression and anger. Some days I felt worse than ever, but I kept my appointments. I kept going to my counsellor. I cried, I wrote in my journal, I went for walks, sometimes to exercise, sometimes just to think. I wish I could say I spent hours in prayer, but the truth is that I felt too numb to pray. I remember sitting in my parked car one night and sobbing, Jesus, I just can't take it anymore, you've got to do something. I don't care what or how, but you've got to help me, please. Other than that, I felt too wounded to pray. But I know now that Jesus hears us even when we're hurting too badly to say the words. Late one night I stepped out onto the back porch to feed our golden retriever, and suddenly I had an urge to run. Our house sits on an acre of land and the backyard is bordered by evergreens that loom tall and dark when the sun goes down. And chased by a dog I ran toward the trees at the back. Overhead the stars were glimmering like diamonds in the sky. The cold January night stung my face, arms and lungs. The moon hung like a silver earring in the sky, and it illuminated my crazy path as I ran circles in the grass. I stopped and I watched my breath hanging misty and white before me in the air. I started to smell promise. I could hear the dog panting beside me. That was the first time that I really knew that I was going to be okay. Looking back, my wild midnight run was marked by the first stirrings of hope and joy that I'd experienced in a very, very, very long time. And slowly, my life started to come back together. Karen goes on to describe how her life gradually came back together through counselling, medication, and the very careful management of her and her husband Larry's life. But I want to stop here and just make some comments of my own. And the first one is, why do we talk about depression in a sermon in church? Well, the answer is actually quite simple. In 1990, depression was rated the 4th most debilitating disease in the Western world. And the prediction was that by the year 2020, and that's not far away, it would be the most debilitating disease in our world today. Here in New Zealand, 20% of the population, that's 1 in 5 people. That means probably about 8 or 9 of you here will either have experienced or will experience depression at some point in your life. Half of you would then be likely to suffer a relapse. And from looking at the Pharmac website, I can tell you that each year for the last 5 years, New Zealand has spent more on antidepressant and antipsychotic medications than in any other area of the pharmaceutical budget. Depression is a very real illness, and it's one that affects a large proportion of our population, and Christians are not immune to it. Christians are not immune to it. And even a quick glance through Scripture will show you that fact. In fact, some of the more prominent biblical characters like David, Job and Elijah are especially noted for the way in which they had to grapple with what reads like depression. Just reading David's psalm, one of David's psalms, Psalm 13, gives you a sense. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts every day and have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? But you know what's also interesting about the Psalms is that they are often the parts of Scripture that are the most comforting for people suffering from depression, because there's a kind of very raw honesty in the Psalms. The psalmists are not afraid to tell it as it really is, are they? People feel less alone when they read the Psalms because they draw comfort from hearing people share very similar experiences, emotions and stories to themselves. and they also draw comfort from the writer's conclusions that despite outward circumstances and inner feelings, God is still near. And then there's Elijah in the reading that Dori read for us today. In verse 4, Elijah feels like a failure and he wants to die. He's suicidal. He's just won a great victory over the prophets of Baal, and yet he runs in fear from the threatening words of Jezebel. His perspective on things is a little bit out of kilter. He should be on top of the world. And yet in verse 10 he says that he's the only one left in all of Israel that still has faith. But he knows himself that that's not true. He's just had a conversation not that long ago with Obadiah, the king's palace manager, a man of faith, who has hidden 100 of the prophets of Israel in caves and is supplying their daily needs of food. There are still many people of faith in Israel, many people. But for Elijah, he's just in such a place that he thinks he's all alone, that he's the only one. And what about King Saul? Saul, David's nemesis. His mood swings were so extreme and paranoid that a psychiatrist today might classify him as bipolar, I suspect. But what is it that causes depression? Well, a lot of things. It can be purely physiological. It can be just that straight chemical imbalance caused by the body. Sometimes that can be hereditary, and it can be passed on from generation to generation. But for most people, depression is caused by a gradual build-up of emotional stress that occurs in people when they feel that they've lost control of the course of their lives. For example, they might be in a marriage or a relationship that's really struggling, a job that they don't like. It could be financial difficulty. It could be a constant struggle with self-esteem, weight, the loss of a significant loved one, chronic illness, unemployment, unmet expectations, constant stress or burnout, or even some kind of combination of the above. And the key is that for some people they feel powerless or trapped in or by those circumstances. And despite their best efforts, nothing seems to change. They're trapped in this situation and they work harder and harder and harder to try and fix it, resolve it, get out of it. And it's like they're going nowhere. It's like they're just banging their head against a wall and nothing is changing in life for them. And it just begins to feel overwhelming. And there's this gradual build-up of despair and a feeling that life is without joy, a constant draining struggle with no matter how often they turn it over in their minds, they can't get it fixed. And over time, this has an effect on the way information is transmitted in the brain. What happens is that there is a drop in the level of neurotransmitters between the synapses in the brain, which results in the brain kind of like shutting down a little bit. It's kind of like, we've got a switchboard at the back of the church there, and it's got fuses all over it. If there is an overload in the circuit in this building somewhere, something's gone wrong, it's likely to cause a fire, sparking, the weakest point of the circuit is the fuse, and it will pop first, and the lights will go out, and it will get very dark. But the fuse protects the building from burning down, from the overload. And it's a bit like that in our brains. I think God has deliberately designed our brains in such a way as actually to protect us from burning down. So we get under this point of incredible emotional stress and pressure, and it's like we're going to burn down, we're going to do something very drastic or harmful to ourselves, and rather than allow that to happen, the brain actually begins to slowly shut us down a little bit. It reduces the serotonin levels between the synapses and so on, and you begin to feel very numb and very grey. But let's talk about that a little bit. What does that feel like when you're depressed? Well, like Karen said at the beginning, often you don't feel anything at all. Your feelings kind of shut down, or you go numb. Nothing excites you or upsets you. Simple pleasures that you once enjoyed, like reading a book, become wearying. And any joy you once experienced in life disappears. Every day kind of blurs into the next. And it feels like a deep grey mist or dark cloud begins to surround you. It's like living in a permanently overcast kind of day. The last 3 months have been really wet, haven't they? I'm glad it's changed. But you can imagine maybe the spring that we've had, where it's just with a lot of rain, a lot of overcast, a lot of grey. Imagine that continuing week after week after week, month after month after month, year after year. And that's what it's like for some people. It's like living in a permanent overcast day. And you can imagine, we know all how we felt when there wasn't much sun coming through. Imagine if it went on and on and on, and what that does inside of people. And that's what depression is like. It robs you of the joy of life. Even the simplest tasks become like impassable mountains. Your memory goes, you become constantly tired, you're often unable to sleep, or you sleep all the time. Even the simplest decision, smallest decision leaves you feeling overwhelmed. And for Christians, for us especially, it can be a terrible thing. We often feel very guilty about being depressed because that means we're not, didn't Christ come to set us free from all of this? Shouldn't we be succeeding? But because of the nature of the illness, depressed people often find it hard to pray. Church services don't inspire them. God often feels like a million miles away. But I can tell you with perfect assurance, and it's an assurance that comes from a hard-won perspective, that God is still there. That God is still there with you even in the hard times. And often it is in the midst of people's deepest depression that some people have their closest encounters with God. Possibly because they're more honest at that time with God about what their life is really like, and probably because their need is greater. And then of course, we've got the whole stigma of mental illness. The belief that somehow mental illness makes you weaker and therefore lesser as a person. But where is it written that a mental condition is any different from a physical one? Illness is just illness. It doesn't matter if you've got a broken leg, a poisoned hand, or emotional overload. It's just illness. It's just something going wrong with the body. But no one, of course, wants to stay in a state of depression, do they? So what can you do to overcome it? Well, I want to suggest 5 things to you. Number 1, you've got to recognise that you've got the illness in the first place. Can we put up that PowerPoint? Right, well, I might quickly click on it. First thing you've got to do is work out whether you've got depression, okay? And up here we've got this is a kind of version of the PHQ questionnaire. Is it going to work? No, it's not going to work. It's a bit naughty. Okay, I'll read the questions out. Number 1, do you have feelings of sadness or irritability? Do you have a loss of interest or pleasure in things that you once enjoyed? Are you experiencing changes in weight or appetite, changes in your sleeping pattern, feelings of guilt, feeling hopeless or worthless? Do you have an inability to concentrate? Is it going to move on for me? Memory becoming erratic? Inability to make decisions, constant fatigue or loss of energy, restlessness or agitation, and decreased ability to perform, and possibly thoughts of suicide or death. If you could tick 5 or more of those things, then the doctor would say to you, you might well have depression and we need to investigate this further. Often they'll ask you in a way like, you feeling, everyone feels sad at times or irritable, but if it's chronic in the sense that it carries on for week after week for months at a time, then it's more than just normal sadness. And they would say, well, you need to investigate this further. Or they'll ask you questions like, is it not at all, a little bit, a lot, or all of the time, for those sorts of things. So, for example, often people do think of suicide or death. They go through something pretty tough in life. But are you thinking about it a lot of the time? Is it something that's constantly on your mind? And then if you answer with tick 5 or more of those, then the doctor would say, there's something that you need to do. I'll just leave that there. So you need to figure out whether or not you've actually got this, Don't just, if you're experiencing this kind of stuff, don't just sit there, go and, talk to the doctor, talk to me, talk to someone, and figure out if this is what you've got. Talk to a close friend. Secondly, you've got to get help. Very rarely can a person struggling with depression sort it out by themselves. And that help should include counselling to identify the issues, what the issues are, and usually some kind of medication to give you temporary relief, enough to enable you to work through the counselling processes and the decisions that you're making. I often describe it in this way for people. Everyone lives with stress in life. It's like you've got water up to your knees. Okay, you're standing in the pool and you've got water up to your knees, and everyone experiences stress like that. That's normal. That's normal. But for some people in life, they find that over time they drift down towards the deep end of the pool, and suddenly they find themselves one day at a point in the pool where the water level's up to here and it's lapping over their lips and they can't breathe anymore. They're struggling to breathe and they're getting anxious and anxiety starting to come. And suddenly that's the place where it's just got overwhelming, too much for you. That's where you need help. Medication is like someone has rowed out a little boat to you in the middle of the pool and dropped a really big concrete block next to you in the pool that you've been able to stand on, and it lifts you up artificially out of the water by a foot or two. That gives you the space that you need to be able to begin to deal with the issues that are being revealed in counselling. That's why you've got to do both. It's not enough just to have the medication, because that doesn't resolve the causes of the depression in the first place. You've got to do both. And you've got to act on the things that have been revealed in the counselling. Medication by itself will bring you temporary relief, but it's not going to solve the problem long term. And you might need to make some really tough decisions about life. It might be about your job. You might choose to leave your job. It might be about your marriage. It might be about your workload. This is about your life. If you just choose to ignore it, then it's a bit like just popping the fuse back in without figuring out where the overload came from. It's a dangerous situation. Fourthly, realise that although 80% of people do recover from depression, half of them run the risk of incurring it again. So always be on the alert. I know for myself that I'm very aware of the danger signals when depression hits, and I can feel it myself, and I know when I'm working too hard and I feel the anxiety coming on, all of those kind of things. And then I make decisions and choices about what I'm doing or not doing, okay? And I will cut things out or get some exercise or something like that. And there are lots of places you can go for help and information. For teenagers is a fantastic website called thelowdown.org.nz, and for adults, you'll recognise this guy, John Kerwin. He fronts the website depression.org.nz. Great websites, one's for adults, one's for younger kids, but they both give the evaluation questionnaires, they both give you lots and lots of information to help you deal with the issue. And then there's even helplines as well. But finally, I want to say that despite how you might feel at the time, the sun is always shining above the overcast clouds. Life is not always as it seems, and while it might feel like when you're in the midst of depression that God has deserted you, the reality is that He hasn't. And often, like the footprints poem, it just means that He's carrying you, even though you don't really know it. There are two verses in Romans that I find really powerful that I want to finish with. Romans. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will ever be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Nothing. And that includes depression.